Quiet Riot.
Hello and welcome to another Quiet Riot Sunday School edition. With me, Naomi.
And me, Alex. This weekend, the far right have been rioting across the country, from Bristol to Belfast, Sunderland to Liverpool. Libraries, cars and advice centres have been set on fire and shops have been damaged and looted. While awful, those can be repaired.
But the damage done to fragile communities and to families and individuals now too afraid to go outside, to go to mosque or perhaps even to school is unacceptable, and we're both completely livid. So we wanted to join you today to process how we're feeling, a kind of therapy session, if you like, because the only riot we approve of is a quiet riot. So thank you for tuning in.
What struck you particularly, Naomi?
Well, the right-wing media are broadly being condemning of it all, and calling violent racist thugs out for what they were and are. There hasn't been too much sort of, Starmer's being incredibly soft and this is all his fault. And I mean, there is some of that, but not as much as one might have feared.
There's been some of the opposite, actually. There's been some people saying Starmer has been too hard, and that's provoked rioters even more.
I saw somebody, I can't remember who it was to attribute them on Twitter, but bravo them, saying he's living his best life because he's getting to both be Prime Minister and Chief Prosecutor all at the same time.
It's interesting that he was in charge of the CPS during the London riots.
Yes, and I remember them very vividly because a lot of the kids that were caught looting Foot Locker in Tottenham got arrested in dawn raids in Pimlico.
Yeah.
Lots of them were my neighbours. We heard police battering down doors at 5 a.m. and grabbing these kids out. Now, they weren't far-right kids. That was a different thing. They weren't really buoyed up by the FASH at that time.
A lot of courts sat through the night.
They did.
People were charged very, very quickly and sentenced very, very harshly. And that was one of the factors that sort of put a dampener on the rioting. And I wonder if we will see that same pattern repeat itself, or whether Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, has slightly different considerations to think of.
And we are in a different time with the public services and the judicial system and overcrowding in prisons and a probation service completely on its knees, unable to cope with the number of people they're meant to be keeping an eye on. So it is a very, very different environment with which you can do some of this stuff, I would imagine.
I guess what I find quite strange about my emotional reaction to this is that we are obviously at a very dangerous inflection point. And yet I find myself feeling hopeful. And I know that sounds weird, but it feels to me like this could have lit the touch paper in a very different, much bigger way, and it's failed to. Even though the protests have been widespread and destructive, they've been small. So what I tend to see is a sort of a band of 200 to 400 people in each of these cities and towns.
Doncaster one got cancelled because only one FASH turned up, all on his lonesome.
I mean, when you're talking about Sunderland, a city of 250,000 people, and you see a sort of rally of 300, 400 people, quite a lot of whom have been bussed in from the outside, to me, that doesn't seem like the success they would be hoping for. I think they slightly jumped the shark with hanging it on this peg.
The peg being the murder of the little girl.
Yes, absolutely. So in quite a weird way, their misinformation has ended up misinforming them. Obviously, it seems to me, this was organized and planned, right? This didn't spring up completely organically. Somewhere in between football seasons, because that's part of it, absolutely. It's not a coincidence that the sort of European Championships just finished and the new Premiership season hasn't quite begun yet. It is when firms tend to find themselves at a loose end. And so it feels like this was quite well coordinated in advance, at least in an informal way. I mean, I'm not saying there's some sort of malign intelligence coordinating it all, but it feels like there had been messaging out there that if anything happens this summer, we sort of go for it because there's now a Labour government and no one's showing us a bit of ankle.
Right, so you're saying that they were just waiting for a story. They leapt on this one.
They were waiting. Absolutely, they were waiting for a story.
On the lazy assumption that it was a migrant that had committed.
That's right, which was actually their own misinformation. But
Yep.
And then it seems to me that there's been quite a lot of cut through to the fact that this wasn't a migrant and it wasn't someone Muslim, which has really sucked a lot of support away from them, because a lot of people are going, well, why are you doing this? You know, why are you going to that town that's been already terrorized and traumatized and just trashing everything?
Yep.
And the photos of them looting shops and setting stuff on fire. And the other aspect of it is that on the back of that, it seems to me a lot of prominent commentators and leadership figures in that hard right space were again too quick to hitch their wagon to this particular star. And now there's a lot of criticism. They seem to be in a bit of a panic. They swam out a bit too far from shore, basically, and I see a lot of people trying to swim back very quickly.
So let me ask you this, as hopeful as you are, you've been mistaken in the past as somebody of Muslim heritage. In fact, you've been cast in
all the time.
All sorts of plays as somebody of Arab descent. Whether or not these lesser sized riots than feared, they're still very angry, large, muscly white men screaming horrendous, racist, Islamophobic abuse, threatening people on their way into mosque. You know, the size may be small relatively, but the impact on people and how they're going to live their daily lives. And you know, my neighbour's a Muslim. I haven't heard a peep out of them all weekend. They've definitely not left the front door. They've got 3 boys aged, you know, teens down to, I'd say, about 6. You must also have some concern for...
Completely. I was at a friend's for dinner yesterday, and I would, without a second thought, ordinarily take the night tube back. It's a lot faster, and I'm lucky enough that the Jubilee line is one of the ones that works pretty well all night. And last night I didn't. I took a cab because there could be loads of drunk morons on the tube spoiling for a fight. So absolutely it's affected my behavior, and I'm thinking about it. I mean, I'm not trying to detract from the danger.
No, I know you're not.
I'm just saying my emotional landscape is more complicated than I thought it would be at this point, because there is something about this that feels like the truth is they've had a really bad year, Naomi, the FASH. At the beginning of the year, we were looking at a very different landscape. And then the European election didn't go their way in the sort of mega wave that they thought it would be. Modi lost his majority in India. Le Pen came third in France. Starmer got a massive landslide here. And now it looks as if Trump is in danger in the States as well. The Republican polling seems to be in a bit of a tailspin. Obviously, many a slip twixt cup and lip. But it's not a good moment for them. And something about it feels like they're having their final tantrum by the checkout. Do you echo any of this, or are you receiving it completely differently?
I think I just come at it from a different perspective. Partly having grown up in a war zone in Northern Ireland during the 90s and sort of witnessing firsthand divided communities and terrible sectarian violence, and so I've never had a laissez-faire attitude towards the far right. I mean, not that in Northern Ireland that's necessarily the dividing line. But when I think about my first foray into politics in the mid-noughties, the BNP were winning councillors all over the country. and far right MPs doing or MEPs doing well in European elections. So the far right are always with us. Then they never go away. It is a fact of life, I think, that they are always there. They just have peaks in their activity, and this peak is, I agree, nowhere near as so far as big as one may have feared it could be. But I don't think we ever breathe a sigh of relief. You have to have constant and ever vigilance around those threats and those that seek to drive populist rhetoric and divide us. So I have some sense of relief that this hasn't been worse, but it's also such an inevitability that when you take your eye off the ball and you don't continue to stamp out the seeds of nasty right-wing populism, this will continue to happen.
Quiet Riot.
I was reflecting after the election about Best for Britain, my organisation, and where we're going to go with it. And I was thinking back to, why did I quit my accountancy job to become a full-time campaigner? What was it about the referendum on Europe that made me so incensed? And I couldn't put my finger on it totally at the time, but with reflection, I now can. I am an avid European. I am a Euromaniac, largely driven because of having a belief in international liberal democracy and the rules-based order, and because of the peace and security that comes with being in a bloc together. But my big fear, of course, I wanted Britain to stay in the EU, but my big fear was that if Leave won, it would unleash forces that I would find so abhorrent and that I felt was so dangerous to the country. And it did. We have empowered the right. And with that, therefore, what happens at the edges of right and left? We have seen very right-wing governments, very, very right-wing Home Secretaries in that period of time. We have seen terrible comment coming from our most senior elected government politicians over migrants and immigrants. And the whole, the fact that a lot of these people chanting "Stop the boats" this weekend, well, where did they get that line? They got that line directly from the government. So it's not that I don't share your hope. I just think I never can rest when it comes to the far right, because they don't.
And there's a second line, incidentally, that they've picked up directly from them, which is this notion of two-tier policing or two-tier justice. That was Suella Braverman in 2023.
Indeed.
That was the op-ed that she was sacked over. So that is directly coming from there. Look, I don't wish to minimize it, but when those exact same right-wing commentators look at certain kinds of environmental protests, and they conclude that even if you had a point, constantly frightening or inconveniencing people will not win them over, it just puts everyone off. But what's interesting is the right-wing space, all of them see it when it comes to environmental protests, but they don't see it when it comes to this. And I think it is there with this.
Of course.
My sense is that every day this shit goes on, people get fed up with it. Every time they're photographed smashing up a shop, or they're doing a Nazi salute, or they're marching next to someone with a swastika tattoo, CCTV clicking on them, police intelligence improving. Every day it goes on, a few more of their organizers will end up in a jail cell. Every day it goes on, their influence diminishes among the press and the political class because, as we've seen in today's newspapers, they need to distance themselves from it. And it's interesting that every single front page today calls them thugs and far right, even though when Starmer used that description in the middle of the week, he got criticized by a lot of the very same press. And today, on the front page of every single one of them, it's either far right or thugs or some such word splashed. It seems to me this is something that will lose them a lot of support because they hung it on the wrong peg. Like, if something had happened that involved, by coincidence, an immigrant that was a Muslim, I think this could have genuinely spun out of control for now. But because I think they made that big strategic error at the start, it's piffled out.
I hope so. There are a lot of helicopters going over central London as we speak, so
Yeah.
I hope that's not in reaction to a new riot happening somewhere in the capital. But go on, tell us about the Mail on Sunday, who take maybe a slightly different...
So Sarah Vine, a friend of mine, a newspaper man, once told me that when a newspaper goes with an opinion piece for its front page, it means that it doesn't have news it can manipulate into what it wants to say. So
that is very believable, Alex.
So the Daily Mail has gone with Sarah Vine's piece on its front page. The title, incidentally, the big headline is Summer of Discontent. And the piece reads, almost half a century ago, a Labour government led by Jim Callaghan presided over the so-called winter of discontent. Now, barely weeks after winning power, our shining new Labour Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, faces what can only be described as a summer of discontent. In no particular order, Hugh Edwards,
where are we going with this?
erstwhile voice of the nation, turns out not only to be Auntie's creepy uncle, but also paedophile. And, and I just think, how do you hang that one on Keir Starmer? And if you're not going in a particular order, why not start with the riots going up and down the country rather than... There will be an attempt to pull all of this together into some kind of, see, we told you it would be chaos and anarchy under Labour. But it seems to me that it's also equally a huge opportunity that if Keir Starmer actually manages this crisis well, it will make life very, very difficult for the right wing.
May I ask you, when we're talking about who needs to be punished, yes, the violent racist thugs causing damage to people and property, but let's talk for a minute about those that run them, that are at the beating heart of these terrible movements. And as I understand it, there is no EDL anymore. There are two kind of spin-off groups that are a bit People's Front of Judea and Judean People's Front in terms of their names. And then also the enablers, the tech companies. We've seen an enormous amount of online activity from the right as well as the far right. We know that Reform UK, for instance, were doing a huge amount of activity targeting young people via TikTok. I know some people in their late teens, early 20s that voted Reform from very well-off backgrounds, I have to say, very good educations. So what do you think Starmer will be minded to do, if anything, to clamp down on those behind the scenes and the enablers of the tech companies rather than just the individual culprits doing stuff on the streets?
I think there is a real possibility that Twitter might be switched off in the UK. Genuinely.
Okay. That's you out of a job.
Yes,
then.
Please subscribe to the podcast because otherwise we'll have no way of reaching you. There is something very specific going on at the moment, which is Tommy Robinson,
AKA Stephen Yaxley Lennon, let's always call him by his real name.
Yeah. Having absconded from a trial, basically jumped bail, used one of his alternative passports and ran away abroad. And he's now posting stuff from his Costa del Sol exile, fomenting civil disorder in the UK. And I find it extraordinary that that account has not been disabled. And I am absolutely certain that an official request has been made by intelligence services for that account to be disabled. I really think it's going to be quite a focus of a battle. I cannot see how a criminal can basically jump bail, leave a country, and then sitting outside your borders, be sending hate speech into it. I can't see that situation continuing.
Telegram is the app that they use to communicate and decide where they're going to meet and things like that. And that's not a new thing. That's been for a very long time that Telegram has been the go-to resource for coordinating.
Maybe. I mean, different considerations come into play when you're talking about security-coded private communications. To someone publicly, a criminal standing outside your country and throwing Molotov cocktails effectively into it. I think there is a clash. I wanted to ask you something because I think you understand that kind of movement better. What do you think of the counter protests? Because I am a little bit in two minds. On the one hand, I like it when people show up in numbers and say, no, not in our city. On the other hand, I do think it makes life even more difficult for the police, because the
Yeah,
task then becomes to
Mhm.
keep them apart from each other. What do you think?
I agree entirely with the gut reaction you've had. On the one hand, seeing Liverpudlian grandmas with Nans Against Nazi posters that they've scribbled with biro themselves and gone out onto the streets with is incredibly heartwarming, and it is lovely to see. And these will be women that look like the Nans of the nasty far right thugs out there. So it's lovely. But yes, it does add both to the temperature and winds up the FASH into a frenzy even more, to have a real opponent stood in front of them, or across the police dividing line to abuse. And it does make the life of the police much more difficult. I always talk about Hope Not Hate. Nick Lowles is their CEO, who runs it and has done for a long time, has been dedicating his entire life to fighting this kind of stuff. Please do go and check them out. They've got a pledge at the moment about helping people rebuild their communities and what they can do to restore calm and peace within divided neighbourhoods. So do go and check them out. Sign up to that pledge would be my strong advice today. And once you're in their database, they'll be sending you emails about what's going on, how to help, what not to do. And yeah, they need all the support they can get, because they do really great work, and they do a lot of work on the ground in those communities too, and help rehabilitate people who want to leave the FASH. Because if you're sucked into it as a young man for the prestige and the respect that it gives you within this awful group, and then all of a sudden you decide, actually this is terrifying and I want to get out, it's very hard for you to leave. And Hope Not Hate does great work helping young men leave and rehabilitate their lives.
We'll pop a link to their website in the show notes. What next, do you think? I have a feeling that Parliament might be recalled.
Yes, probably. The Lib Dems are not going to miss a trick to call on the Prime Minister to recall Parliament. They love doing that. Anytime we're in parliamentary recess, they don't miss a free press release like that. Certainly, I think we'll potentially see Cobra meetings if it does seem to be getting even more out of hand. But as you say, hopefully that was the pinnacle of it, and it will begin to dissipate now. And I think, are there football matches next weekend?
Next week, the lower leagues
next week.
Start up again, and the week after that, Premiership. That might actually be a flashpoint. We might end up with loads of mini riots basically happening around football matches, which would be harder to police.
Now, remember, football is somewhere where we can win the culture war. If you think about the footballers that have taken the knee in solidarity against racism, when we think about England manager Gareth Southgate being a very good activist manager in terms of trying to lead fans away from the kind of nasty scenes we've seen this weekend, and in favour of diversity and inclusion and brilliance, then I do think that rather than condemning football, and I know you are a football fan, Alex, that it is something that we can do to take the culture war and win it on the terraces, rather than be afraid of that being a place where it fosters. And there are actually groups that do a lot of that work that are separate to Hope Not Hate, who we mentioned earlier, about kicking racism out of football, and we can leave links to that as well.
Actually, in that space as well, that kind of group is dwindling. They're getting smaller and smaller and more marginalized. I mean, even in the last 20 years, there really is no comparison between, the running battles that would happen on the Seven Sisters Road, say, when Spurs were playing Arsenal, and the family match feeling that tends to dominate now, and how small those bands of drunken idiots are, and how much more conscious people are inside the football ground about racist epithets and homophobic epithets. I mean, it really is quite a different world, and that, I guess, is why I think this is a spasm. I keep going back to what Brian Klaas told us on Wednesday, and if you haven't listened to that episode, it really is the most brilliant analysis of the current American political situation.
He is amazing.
I don't think there's anyone like him, actually. And what he was saying, this notion that progress happens 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And it just feels like this is the end of the step back. The 2016 to now was our step back. Because what happened before was not only a Labour government that, despite what people think, I was around. I remember what schools were like and hospitals were like and the welfare state was like. This was a government that pumped a lot of money into mending the fabric of the country. And so it feels like 2016 to now was the slight undoing of that. And the country's ready to spring forward again. And I hope I'm right.
And I so hope you are right. We should probably call it a day there.
Yeah, we
Alex.
should.
Thank you for helping me get all of that off my chest.
You and me together, mate. So thank you to listeners for giving us a small part of your Sunday. As always, we'll speak to you next week, probably before the regular episode, but certainly by Wednesday, Thursday. Thank you for listening.
Bye. Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads with Naomi Smith, Alex Andreu and Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangeeta, artwork by Simona Canelu. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Soundstone Global.
Quiet.